everyone. Welcome to your Thursday injection of marine science. We're glad to have you with us again this evening.
You're already laughing. We haven't even started the joke yet, and you're already giggling.
That's because I'm getting some feedback from our audience. So they're ready for the jokes. So we'll start with Steve. I'll direct this joke to you.
All right.
What do you call the stuff that's stuck between the teeth of a shark?
Oh boy. I have no idea.
Slow swimmers.
Jeez.
Oh God.
They're just getting worse. They really are getting worse at this point.
I don't know if the jokes are getting worse or my sense of humor is getting worse, but
I'm not even sure what I'm laughing at this point.
my jokes aren't good, but boy, are they not tasteful. Right. Craig and audience, here's one for you guys. What happened to the shark that got famous?
No clue.
He became a starfish. Just hang your head in shame, Craig.
No.
All right, we've descended into the appropriate.
Wait a minute. How am I supposed to start after that now?
This concludes tonight's broadcast.
Yeah, then we're over. Cutting this off.
You guys are hilarious. All right, chaos achieved. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn off my mic and camera. And again, to our audience out there, thank you for being so involved in the jokes. It's hilarious. I'll see you after the talk.
Bye, Mert. I don't know how I'm supposed to start after that, Steve. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. I hope I find you and your family and friends safe and in good health this evening. I'm Craig McLean. I'm the executive director for LumCon. And I want to thank you for joining us again tonight for LumCon's online science series. Every Thursday night here at 7 p.m. Central, we're inviting Louisiana scientists to share their research. And we'll give you the opportunity to listen and ask questions of some truly amazing scientists doing some truly amazing work. And I hope you will continue to join us each and every week as we explore more of the world from the comfort of our homes. And of course, you can always find more information about the complete series at our website, lumcon.edu. Just scroll down on our homepage to the link under news and events, and you'll see the whole series there, including links to previous speakers, including yours truly. We have a series of YouTube videos of the previous lectures that you can watch. So tonight is my privilege to introduce Dr. Steve Midway, who got his bachelor's in wildlife and fisheries biology from the University of Vermont, then went in and got a master's in fisheries and wildlife sciences from the North Carolina State University, and then a PhD in marine biology from University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Did I mention that I used to work at Duke? Are we gonna have issues tonight?
I've never heard of Duke. What is that?
He's currently serving as the assistant professor of fish ecology at Louisiana State University in the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences. And his research ranges from the headwaters to the coast, studying fish and fish populations and communities, and the people that make up those fisheries. And we're very glad to have you with us tonight. Steve, really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much, Craig. Great. Well, yeah, I appreciate everyone joining us here. I want to talk to everyone tonight about a line of research that I'm active in, which is thinking about shark attacks. I will mention that, as Craig alluded to earlier, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences, and I study fish and fisheries ecology, sort of writ large, freshwater fish, coastal fish, marine fish, study the anglers that harvest them, and everything in between. In terms of, proportion of my research effort, shark attacks is probably the smallest, unfortunately, but it certainly is one of the most interesting and one of the more popular things. So that's a way to sort of couch this talk in terms of my larger research program. If anyone has questions, obviously, about shark attacks, but also about any other fish or fisheries issues, specifically in Louisiana, happy to talk with you about that. But let's talk about shark attacks and, in fact, trends in global shark attacks, which is the title of this talk. Before we get into that, I just want to give you sort of the cast of characters here. So this study was conducted by 3 individuals, including myself. The first one is Dr. George Burgess, who is now retired emeritus at the University of Florida. George is the shark attack expert, probably the world's shark attack expert. If you haven't heard or seen George, you may have not known it when you've seen him as he makes the rounds, usually in the early summer, on all the TV stations and radio stations when the first attacks start, to be reported in the summer. And George says, all the really measured, smart things about how sharks are not out to get you. We're in their habitats. Here's the things you can do to avoid shark attacks. So George has been really a pleasure to work with and has access to this wonderful data that we've used. Tyler Wagner is a assistant unit leader at the Pennsylvania U.S. Geological Survey Cooperative Research Unit. And Ty and I go back almost a decade working on a lot of collaborative things. And in this particular project, Ty helped out a lot with some of the nuts and bolts of the modeling that we did. So he had a really, expert and specific role in this. And then again, I was sort of the straw that stirred the drink to get this moving. I'll also briefly mention that this particular talk is tightly linked to a publication that came out last year, a publication of the same name. This is in PLOS One. It's open access, so it is freely available to anyone with an internet connection. If you have trouble finding it, email me or contact me and make sure you get a copy of it. So if I skip over anything, and you'll hear me kind of mention parts of the talk where I'm not going to have time to get into details, all of those details can be had by either asking a question or accessing the article after the presentation. So shark attacks. Shark attacks are something that I'm guessing we all have knowledge of. We've all heard of shark attacks. Most of our knowledge of shark attacks, though, or exposure to shark attacks, comes from cinema, from television and movies. That started unofficially with Jaws in the mid-70s, which by most accounts is a cinematic masterpiece. My own personal opinion there. We've seen a large number of shark attack movies, made for TV movies, shows, documentaries, etc., that are highly variable in terms of their sort of quality and information. But again, I guess if you're producing these, information transfer is not your primary objective. It's all about making entertaining horror movies or suspense. So where do all of these pieces of media come from? Well, they are to some degree grounded in the reality or the truth that sharks inhabit the oceans, oftentimes the coastal areas of the ocean, and humans also like to spend time in coastal parts of the ocean where attacks sometimes happen. Attacks are incredibly rare, and I'll get into that momentarily. But based on how the media reports on attacks, it drums up some interest in what a shark attack may or may not be like, depending on how it's portrayed. So this is the overall kind of feel that we all have from shark attacks. If anyone here in the audience has been attacked by a shark, I would love to hear your firsthand account, or if you know anyone. But every time I say that, I've yet to really encounter anybody that's had an attack. So it really is something that lives in our imaginations, for lack of a better way to put it, because it is such a rare event. And in fact, when we look at some data from the University of Florida, we can see here that, obviously we all know the statistics that shark attacks are rare, but just how rare they are is quite amazing. Things like accidental poisoning and bike crashes and things like that are more likely to kill you than a shark attack. So this is really, an unlikely event for all of us. However, it occupies a disproportionate amount of space in our heads as we, think of it as a risk or perceive it to be a risk. So given that, several years ago, I was, following the news, and it had been a summer where a lot of attacks were seemed to happening in a short amount of time. And of course, the news media spun it up. And I got to thinking, boy, that's, this is an interesting topic. What constitutes a lot of shark attacks? If we have 2 shark attacks in a month on the East Coast of the U.S., or if we have 10 shark attacks in 1 month on the East Coast of the U.S., how are those different? How do we know if 10 is a lot or 2 is a little, or how does that compare against, the history and the context of these? So I soon learned out that data was available to do this, but that was sort of the primary motivating question. What are the rates of shark attacks across the globe? Because I thought, I don't want to look at one specific area. I'm curious about what's going on across the globe. Second to that, I then thought, well, how have they trended or changed over time? Are we seeing more shark attacks now than we saw 10, 20, 30 years ago? Are we seeing less? Is it pretty much the same, but we just have so much more media time to fill that we need to make those that happen occupy more of that media space? I don't know. And then also sort of practically, I was curious what activities are associated with shark attacks. And so these were some of the questions that were going through my head when I was thinking about envisioning this research and what it might look like and what those directives might be. So a really quick background on sharks. I'm sure we have a really, marine science savvy audience here, but I'll just remind everyone that they're a diverse group of cartilaginous fishes. So they're not bony fishes, they're cartilaginous. They're diverse to the tune of several hundred species, most of which, we don't know very well. Scientists don't know very well. You might not recognize if you heard their name. So they're, again, very understudied in that sense too. They tend to have an equilibrium life history, and that's really just a way of saying that they mature late in life and they tend to produce a lower number of offspring. So a lot of fish, we think about maybe a menhaden or a pogie. It's going to mature at age 1 or 2. It's going to produce 1 million eggs. Sharks are not at all like that. Sharks tend to mature after several years and may produce just a single-digit number of offspring. And this makes you in some ways resilient to environmental change, but it also makes the shark vulnerable to overfishing, because when you remove and harvest fishes that have an equilibrium life history, it takes a lot more time for them to recover from overfishing. So that's a concern. Many species of sharks are migratory, crossing ocean basins and large areas. Many stocks are overfished, going back to that equilibrium life history. We talked about how they're generally understudied. They certainly occupy a large amount of interest by scientists and the public, but in general, we know less about them than we'd like to. And then when it comes to attacks, we have about plus minus 6 human fatalities per year from around 75 to 100 unprovoked attacks. So yes, 75 to 100 people on average are going to, be attacked by a shark in a given year. But the fatality rate is relatively low, at least again, compared to what Hollywood might suggest. So again, all of this suggests that sharks kind of have a bad rap. And I can tell you that sharks, again, as you all know, they don't seek out people to eat. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Humans eat, thousands of tons of sharks every year. So it really is sort of a one-way street when it comes to who eats who. However, that's not the way the story is often portrayed. So to get into the study, the questions we were trying to answer, we knew we needed data. We're obviously not going to go out and really collect shark attack data. It happens quite slowly. It's unpredictable, but I knew that this data source existed, and it was sort of curated and managed by George Burgess. And this data set is called the International Shark Attack File, which is sort of the world's, preeminent quality controlled data set of all shark attacks that are, reported with any sort of veracity going back to the late 50s. It's not really a publicly available data set, although parts of it are available upon request. I'll sort of caution everybody that there's also a global shark attack file, I want to say it's called, and that is a similar sort of competing shark attack data set, but it's not quite up to the same quality control standards that the ISAF is, or the International Shark Attack File is. So this is the data, again, curated by George Burgess, who really sort of entered in most of the records from that to that data set and knows it very well. Let me advance here. So once looking at the data, we were curious and spent a lot of time thinking about how do we carve this up in terms of location. You know, in some ways you want to think about things small, like a single beach or a county. In other ways, there might not be enough attacks in certain places, so we needed to really include large areas. And what we ended up doing was identifying two spatializations, or two ways that we wanted to look at shark attacks. And the first way was the country level. And that is literally taking 14 countries, all that have had 10 or more shark attacks going back to 1960, and looking at those countries sort of individually. Now, this works pretty well for smaller countries, places that have few shark attacks and you would otherwise not really be able to break them up. However, it doesn't work that well when you're talking about larger countries, and again, oftentimes those countries that tend to have quite different habitats and sharks. So we wanted to keep the country analysis, but in order to focus on those areas where we tended to see large numbers of shark attacks, we identified 7 regions. And these regions needed to have at least 100 or more shark attacks going back to 1960. And these regions were a little bit more ecologically relevant in the sense that, let me pick on, you know, the U.S. At the country level, the U.S. is one country. But we know that what happens on the East Coast with regard to shark attacks might be very different from the West Coast, which might be very different from Hawaii, because those are very different habitats and they're inhabited by oftentimes very different sharks. So clustering those 3 regions together in one country is not ideal. And again, that's why we pursued this region level analysis, which the regions are still quite large, but at least we could say these are justifiably areas that are likely to undergo the same dynamics based on what species are there, what the habitats are like, and so forth and so on. So one of the unique things that we wanted to do was confront all the shark attack data with some measure of human presence, right? A best case scenario would be to know how many people are in the water and how many hours they spend in the water. Well, that data doesn't exist. You know, it barely exists in very small places for very small amounts of time. It certainly does not exist across the world going back to 1960. So we had to basically come up with some proxy which we identified as human population. So for the country level analysis, we took the annual population for each of the 14 countries, and that data came from the World Bank. And then for our region level analysis, we took populations from only those regions adjacent in the country adjacent to the marine habitat we were looking at. So for example, at the country level analysis for the US, we took the entire population of the US. In the region level analysis for the West Coast, we took the populations of Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and California. Similarly, we took all the states on the eastern seaboard and Gulf for the eastern, and then for Hawaii, we took the population in Hawaii. So that's how we broke down the region level populations, similarly with South Africa and Australia, which constituted the other locations. Not a perfect measure by any stretch of who's in the water, but at this really large macro scale, it's kind of all we can really do to look at. So next we got to thinking about the model. We want to come up with a model that tells us about the trends in shark attacks over time. We have the data we have are shark attacks, so we know in these different locations, year to year, how many attacks occurred. We have human population, which is not so much a predictor variable or something that we're really focused on, other than to help us understand that if sharks attacks have gone up, might that really mean that the rate has stayed the same because the human population has gone up? For example, if you have 1 shark attack and 100 people, and you have 2 shark attacks and 200 people, well, those are actually the same rate of attack. And that's what we were curious in sort of teasing out, if possible, to say, is what we're seeing in the shark attack data just a reflection of more people being in the water? The data we don't have, and I mention this just because it's naturally going to be something you'll think about as we discuss limitations, we don't have that tourism data or anything that's even closer in terms of a signal of who's in the water, how long are they in the water. We don't have information on shark populations. Unfortunately, it would be great to know the number of sharks in the water. Certainly over the time span we're looking at, there are going to be years when shark populations are higher and years when shark populations are lower, but that data just simply doesn't exist at the scale we need it. And then finally, shark species. We do have the species for a lot of the records of the attacks, but they're oftentimes self-reported or incomplete. So we kind of kept shark species out of it, but I put an asterisk next to it because in the regional breakdown and the regional assessment, those habitats really, I would say, moderately to strongly correlate with certain shark species. So when we look at, for example, the west coast of the U.S., we know that that's primarily white sharks. There's really not a ton of other shark species that are attacking humans on the west coast of the U.S. And again, similarly, those different regions sort of had different characteristic sharks in them. So the next thing we thought of, well, what about a linear model, right? The Swiss Army knife of statistics. It's the model we all learned in middle school and high school, the y equals mx plus b. You get a cloud of dots and you put a line through it. What about that linear model? Would that be a good way to look for a change, or I should say, any type of trend? Well, we thought about it and we thought, you know what, there's a couple things that concern us. The first is what we call an autoregressive structure, and that's just a fancy way of saying that a point in time is related to a previous point in time. So, the classic example of an autoregressive structure is something where whatever happened yesterday or whatever measurement you had yesterday is going to look a lot like today. So if you all, weighed yourself yesterday and then you weighed yourself today, maybe a pound or two plus or minus, but you're not going to swing, 50 or 100 pounds one way day to day. So we knew that shark attacks likely had some of that going on because the number of sharks in the water, while it changes, it's not, probably drastically changing year to year. And human populations are increasing, but again, not drastically changing year to year. So we were concerned about this underlying autoregressive issue. Another thing that a linear model would not be able to handle is a phase change. And a phase change is when you have one, or I should say two or more trends going on in the data. But again, the linear model, you get one line to characterize that. So a hypothetical example here would be as if you had a couple years where shark attacks were increasing, maybe some preventative measures were taking place, shark nets, maybe people stopped going to the beach. A number of things could happen that could really change the number of attacks at a location, and yet with one line to describe those two or more different sort of relationships, you can miss it, or worse, you can kind of describe a relationship that doesn't fit either one of them. And then finally, sort of the, not the worst of the things that you might have to deal with a time series in a linear model, but you can also get poor prediction. In certain places, you may have low shark attack numbers and high shark attack numbers all within a relatively small amount of time. And so, yes, again, we can fit a line to that, but is that line really telling us much? Can that line tell us with any sort of certainty what's going to happen next year? We were concerned about that. So given these concerns, we realized that a time series data requires a time series model. Meaning a model that's going to be able to handle some of the complexities that we get in time series data. Of course, we didn't want to just say this. We wanted to say we're going to need a bigger model, which is what you do when you're studying sharks. So we sort of put our heads together and we determined that this Bayesian dynamic linear model would be our best choice. Now I'm going to stop here and not really go into this at all. This model is here to show you that for those of you that are interested, this is how we modeled the shark attacks. The model and the explanation is in the paper, but I'm going to proceed ahead because I don't really want to go under the hood too much with the model given the time limits that we have. I will say one cool thing the model does is it estimates an annual change from year to year and those trends by directly comparing estimates for one year to the following year. And to say that another way, what the model is doing is it takes an estimate in a given year and says, okay, now how does that compare to the estimate last year? And there's a little bit more to it, but what it does is it allows a a probability to be applied to whether or not the attacks in that year are increasing or decreasing from the previous year. Now, if you have around 50 attacks in a given year in a given location, and then one year you have 50 and the next year you have 51, yeah, you're increasing, but really, is that truly a trend? Is that a probability of a high chance of a change occurring? Probably not. And the model will pick that up and say, okay, yeah, there's one more shark attack, but really based on the numbers, this is not a trend or a change. Versus if you tend to be around, say, 10 shark attacks over many years, and then you bump up to 30 or a high number or even a low number, then this trend detection will say, hey, this probability is really high. So it allows us to understand sort of the relative magnitude of the change. It's not used in this way, but it could be used by managers if they were to say, look, we are not interested in a 50 or a 75% increase in shark attacks because we can live with that. But once we get to 90, then we need to maybe revisit a beach policy or something like that. So this was one fun thing that the model did, and I'll get into some figures momentarily that describe how to interpret that and what it's showing. So getting into results, here's sort of the bean counting of looking at the different countries with the total number of attacks in that far right-hand column under N. And as you can see, the U.S. leads the world in shark attacks. The good news, though, is that we also lead in the number of non-fatal shark attacks. So I guess the takeaway here is if you're most likely to attacked in the U.S., but at the same time, you're also most likely to live if you were just to sort of look at these numbers straight up. That's not a real great way to interpret that, but I think you guys get my point. I'm not sure if this is due to reporting in medical facilities and other ways to deal with it, or if it has to do with the offending species of sharks just having sort of less fatal outcomes. I think a lot of those things are at play, but you can get a sense here of where the shark attacks have fallen over the last 50 or so years. The next thing we wanted to ask was, what about those activities that result in a shark attack? So the way to look at this figure is it's a time series in a sense. You can see the years along the bottom, and then you can see the activities which are stacked on each other along that vertical axis. And then again, on the right-hand side, you can see what the colors correspond to, what activity they correspond to. The width of the bars in the time intervals correspond to either more or less. So I tried to point out, for example, the years between 2005 and 2010, there were more shark attacks than the years 1975 to 1980. So the width of the bars is giving you a relative how many attacks, and then the width of the colored bar, the width of the colored segments indicates those activities that were identified or correlated to an attack. The first thing I thought of when I saw this plot, which is totally unofficial and anecdotal, is is that the narrowest bar is 1975 to 1980, which immediately follows the release of Jaws. So my immediate thought was, I wonder if there really are fewer people going in the water after watching Jaws. I'm sure that's me making it up, so please don't interpret that as being the truth. But that's something I noticed. But as you can see, many more shark attacks in recent years compared to the earlier part of the time series. And again, yeah, swimming and surfing, sort of generally speaking, contribute to a lot of the attacks, but they tend to be stable over time. We don't see any, major shifts here, especially over the last, 30 years. So here are the country results of our 14 countries. And again, all these figures are in the manuscript if you want to zoom in on them and take a look at them. But what you're seeing along the bottom axis is time. So starting in 1960, ending in about 2015. And then on the vertical axis, you're seeing the shark attacks per million people in the census or the population. And I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I'll point out that you see some interesting things, such that places like the Fiji Islands or places with low populations tend to also have a low number of attacks, but they tend to have high attack rates. So you can see in the Fiji Islands, the numbers on that left-hand vertical axis range between 0 up to 5. Whereas if you look at the U.S., which has, as we just previously saw, the most shark attacks, the rates only go from 0 to 0.2. So we see a lot more shark attacks in heavily populated countries, but it's a much lower rate than what we're seeing in more remote places. We kind of look at it here, and you can get a sort of a closer up of that really sort of stable, I don't want to call it high, but higher than other places trend of the Fiji Islands. And then clearly an increase in the US, which is of interest, and we'll come back to that. But overall, the numbers just don't get as high as other places. So here's that trend detection that I talked about. When we go from year to year asking, what is the probability of an increase? And so again, we see years on the x-axis on the bottom. On the y-axis, you can see they all range from 0 to 1. And imagine a line almost like Ecuador, a line that really stays flat at 0.5. That's saying there's a 50% chance of an annual increase, i.e. it's a coin flip. There's really no signal in Ecuador that anything changes year to year. They have their small number of shark attacks and they have them regularly, and that's about it. Versus when you get to a place like Australia or South Africa or the US, high numbers of shark attacks in those places have led to this probability of increase being very high or very low. And so we do see in some places, and again, let's zoom in on Fiji and the US here. You can see that in that lower panel for each location, Fiji is very stable. They have a very few number of attacks, and they tend to be comparable most years. There's not really any large spikes. Whereas in the US, you can see that a lot of those points are probably between 0.4 and 0.6, but you certainly get down to 0.1 and 0.2, and in some cases above 0.8 or 0.9. So there really is a change in the rates. And again, that accompanies the places that have the largest numbers. So we just see the largest variability in shark attacks in the places that have the largest numbers of attacks. So let's look at those region results really quickly. These were the 7 regions we looked at, and in red, I've highlighted the places where we have seen some type of increase. And again, this is accounting for human population there, not accounting for tourism or things that are a little bit more practical, but again, data we don't have. And so we can see the eastern US, which is really dominated by Florida. I forget how many of those attacks are exclusive to Florida, but it's a very high number. Hawaii, and then the southern portion of Australia. They've all shown an increase, particularly in the last decade or two. So even adjusting for human population, we've seen a higher rate of attacks, and a larger number of attacks in at least 3 of the world's major regions. And then again, just to follow up with the probability of annual increase, you can see for these locations, they all tend to have higher numbers, so you're going to see more variability. And in fact, in the eastern US, you can find places where within a few years, the probability of increase has gone from 0.9 to 0.1. So it really does change year to year. It's sort of, if you imagine looking at that eastern US plot and looking at those 5 or 6 highest points, those are sort of your generation's summer of the shark, right? So we, every decade or two, we hear about that summer of the shark. And those are in all likelihood, and I haven't run the numbers to support that, but in all likelihood, those are the summers where we see those really dramatic increases. The good news about the summer of the shark is that, probably within 1 to 2 years, you're gonna have a huge decline in the number of attacks. So let's interpret some of this, all of this stuff. You guys hung with me through a lot of figures. I appreciate it. The first thing to take away, shark attack rates are generally low and stable throughout most of the world. They are increasing, and we talked about a few places, namely Hawaii, the eastern US, and the southern portion of Florida, where they are increasing. Now, those have the lowest rates, so I would say they're increasing slightly, nothing to be alarmed about, but relative to the population, there is an increase. Some of the highest rates of shark attacks are in the most remote places. If you look at the Mascarene Islands, and I picked on Fiji earlier, but you tend to see those larger numbers when it comes to the rates. And again, those are due to probably the relatively low population in a lot of those countries. It's also very, very likely due to the fact that we're not accounting for tourism. So the number of people in the water in Fiji or the Mascarene Islands is really, I would imagine, driven by tourism, not just the local population. So that's kind of a weakness that we have here, knowing that for some of these places with higher rates, the numbers are likely inflated due to the lack of accurate accounting of people in the water. And then finally, regions with high human populations tend to have higher attacks, but also more variable attack rates. We kind of just went through that, but again, if you're in particularly the eastern US or Florida and it's a year with a lot of attacks reported, chances are next year is going to be different, or 2 years will be different. I don't want to get into anything in terms of cycles, but it's certainly variable in terms of, you know, increasing and decreasing over time. So a few considerations. No activities were, I'll say, inherently safer or riskier. You know, we didn't really see any strong changes in those activities that were correlated or associated with an attack. Now, we don't know how many people are out there surfing and how many people are out there diving. We don't know those numbers to kind of better interpret when we have numbers of attacks related to those activities. But generally speaking, you know, we don't see anything that suggests that there's one single activity that is much more likely to result in a shark attack. I've said it a number of times, tourism data or something closer to the number of people in the water would really refine our predictor, and it would help. I don't know that it would change the outcomes, but it would certainly be a stronger way to get at this. There's likely some reporting bias in shark attacks. And by reporting bias or detection, I'm talking about, you know, if a shark attack happens, does it get into the database that we're using? Chances are it does. You know, shark attacks are still relatively rare events. They tend to be documented. You know, they tend to involve medical personnel, and you know, word gets around. So we're not too concerned about any missing number of shark attacks. Reporting is likely improved over time. If we think about the conditions that would lead to a shark attack not being reported, it's much more likely that, you know, being on a boat in 1965 in the middle of nowhere, having a non-fatal attack might not make it into the news, versus in, you know, 2015 or 2020, we all have smartphones and keep in touch with each other. I mean, you could probably live tweet a shark attack if you thought about it and had enough time. Finally, small scale dynamics are likely playing some type of role. Small scale dynamics meaning what's going on locally, what's going on at a certain beach or in a certain area. Is it a shark population that's really sticking around that area, but also maybe changing their numbers? Are there shark nets or other shark control measures at play? We're not able to really dial in our model with this. And again, we're interested in large scale, so we know we're missing something here, but that's certainly a future step of this work would be to consider what smaller scale dynamics do to increase or decrease the relative risk of attack. So finally, we get to the part of the program where we talk about how not to get attacked by a shark, which is why I'm sure you're all here. Statistically, we say that there's 2 ways to be a 0. So if you get attacked, you know, you're a 1 in the data file. If you're not attacked, you're a 0. So we all want to be zeros. There's 2 ways to be a 0, and we call each of those either a false 0 or a true 0. A false 0 is someone who doesn't go in the water. False 0 meaning, yeah, you didn't get attacked, but you didn't really count as someone who could have been attacked. What we all want to be, I'm guessing, are true zeros. We want to be those people that get in the water, recreate, study, enjoy, but also come out of the water. And so, you know, those ways to be a true 0, those ways to enjoy the aquatic realm while not being attacked and minimize your risk of attack include things you all have, I'm sure, heard before, but avoid swimming at dawn, dusk, or night. Don't swim with shiny objects on or wounds or blood. And then, of course, obey any local recommendations. None of the material on this slide is really part of our study. This is just sort of best practices that are out there to help everyone enjoy the water as safely as possible. And then finally, because, you know, we're Louisiana based, I wanted to share with you the Louisiana attacks that are in the database. And the, you know, good news or the spoiler is that there's very few. there's actually only been 4 recorded attacks in Louisiana waters. Again, in the data set we have, it's not to say this is comprehensive, but it's very likely close to accurate. Over 100 years ago, there was a fatal attack, and then there have been 3 non-fatal attacks since 1914. 3 of those have occurred in Pontchartrain, likely a bull shark, and then in 98 there was one a little bit farther away offshore, Chandeleur Islands. So that is it. You know, there are a lot of sharks in Louisiana waters, I have no doubt, but the reality is that we don't have a lot of beaches, and near shore we don't have a lot of people you know, surfing and diving and doing all of those sort of blue water activities that you would associate with a coastal environment. So for better or worse, we have a lot of sharks in Louisiana waters, but we don't have a lot of shark attacks. Kind of the best case scenario in my opinion. So with that, I'm sure I've left something out or I've generated some questions. I'm here to answer those questions as best I can, and I appreciate everyone joining.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. We had some questions rolling in while you were presenting, and we have even more questions coming in now. So I will allow those questions to come in at their own pace, but we'll just get started with some that came in while you were talking.
Great.
Sorry, I'm just responding. FJ is asking, wouldn't the data collection be much more accurate than it was in the 60s? Attacks could have been lower simply because of technology or more reporting bias back then? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I tried to allude to that in one of the, in the slide where I had the study limitations. It's certainly, you know, detection of a shark attack is certainly something that, especially going back in time, could be a limiting factor. You know, probably most shark attacks nowadays are going to find their way into some type of media, whether it's social media, popular media, not all of them, but, you know, I would imagine the way that we are technologically connected, I feel as good about the data now as I would going back in time. Certainly when, you know, looking at this data in the 60s and 70s, people were not connected nearly as much. And so there is a greater chance that shark attacks would not have been reported. To what degree they were not reported, I couldn't even venture a guess at that. Other than I don't think that what we're missing would really change the findings here. I don't think that if we magically were able to know all the shark attacks going back to 1960, that we would learn that the 60s was a time that had more shark attacks than currently, just based on the volume of attacks that happen and when they happen. Even if we're missing some earlier in the data, it would have to be a monumental amount of missing data to really change what we found.
Great, thank you. Tori has a question about whether you have plans to gain more tourism data to help with this research. Are there ways that you are looking into to reaching more information from the tourism industry?
Yeah, we have a number of ways or a number of, I guess, new questions that this work has created, and I'll mention them very briefly. I don't have any results to share on them, but certainly tell you what we're up to. One is to look at that really local scale. So looking at tourism data for, you know, certain beaches or certain counties, trying to really get at any sort of local scale dynamics that may or may not be going on. There's inherent challenges to that. I mean, just like we had challenges, there's inherent challenges to that, which is that there's, you know, if you're zooming in, there's really not a lot of places outside of a few counties in Florida where you have a lot of attacks over enough time to have any data to really analyze. Most places in the world, you know, just don't see enough shark attacks to be able to model anything with real accuracy. So there are places though, and we have looked into tourism data that would help that. The other line of inquiry that we're curious about is connecting shark attacks to environmental data. So thinking about, what are the tides that are going on when people are attacked? Obviously, time of day is something that we have, but is a shark attack a low tide or a high tide event? What about the phase of the moon? Is the shark attack associated with clarity on a full moon, or obviously moons and tides are connected, so there's a lot to unpack there. But those are the types of things that we're taking our next steps and trying to think about the best ways to ask those questions, and then the best ways to use the data to try to inform them.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, I'd be interested to see what those trends are, actually.
Yeah, happy to share when we get it done.
Yeah. Claire has a question. She's wondering if any of the rates of attacks coincide with major societal or environmental changes, like hotter than average summers, changes to current shifting where their food is, pandemics increasing, decreasing the number of people at the beaches, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have any data to support that, so I should probably stop talking right now. But my gut instinct is that those activities or events that lead to more people in the water are likely to lead to more attacks. So if we have any sense of or any trust in the findings that as populations go up, attacks go up, it could stand to reason that as there are more people in the water in a shorter time frame, not on a population basis, but on a boy, June and July was a really hot month or months, so the summer was really hot, or gas was cheap, so everybody drove to the beach more. Those types of things, I would guess, certainly have an effect. Although we haven't measured those, and I couldn't really comment on the magnitude of that effect. But certainly, anytime you put more people in the water, you're likely increasing the chance of an encounter with a shark. Which is still a very low chance of anything bad happening. So don't, please go to the beach, please enjoy your summers, and take very, very basic precautions, and you'll be fine. Sorry.
Take those kids to the barrier islands and make them wait out there. We have a comment and 2 questions from Peter. The comment is, hey, good to see you again. It's Peter from UNCW.
Hi, Peter.
He says it's good to see you again virtually. His first question is, do you find the word attack problematic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't prefer the word attack, but that is the word that is most commonly associated with a shark encounter. And so I prefer to, when possible, refer to things as, fatal or non-fatal attacks. Shark bites is another way that it can be described, because that's really what's going on. You're being bitten by something. It's a little bit more measured way of referring to an attack. So I think I probably only use the term shark attack in this presentation, but at times I do prefer other verbiage that doesn't quite demonize the sharks in a way that I think, unfortunately, a lot of folks think of them as something that's out there that exists to attack them when they're in the water, which couldn't be further from the truth.
Great. And Peter's second question is, has there been any retrospective searching of newspapers for reporting of shark attacks or encounters, if you prefer, particularly as newspaper archives are being digitally and are available?
The short answer is I don't know of the specifics, but I'm under the impression that yes, that the International Shark Attack File is not a static document where on December 31st of a given year, the data is entered and it's never returned to. I don't have any, again, I don't curate that data. George curated it until he retired a few years ago. So I don't have any real examples to show you, but I do know that it is dynamic, and as shark attacks are learned of, even if it's decades after, they will be added if they can be verified. I don't know if it goes the other way around, if shark attacks have been removed from the data file, if they were found out to be, fictitious. But to answer your question, yes. I mean, the attack file is managed and curated, and as new information becomes available, it will be added.
Perfect. Christina says, thank you for the fantastic talk. And her question stems from something at the beginning of your talk, and she's wondering if the reason, and it has to do with the shark population numbers. And so she's asking, is the reason for not knowing the shark population's numbers, is it because they're moving around too much, or is their territory too vast and variable?
The reason we don't have better accounting of shark population numbers is because, there's certainly limitations and challenges, like finding them and tagging them and having them move around too much and showing up in places where nobody would report them. But, I think the reality is that we just don't have good shark population numbers in most places, because in order to establish a long-term monitoring program, which is what you need to understand, animal populations, it requires a large amounts of financial investment and human power, and really a sort of research infrastructure that most places either don't have, or if they have them, they're geared toward commercial and recreational fish species that are sort of paying the bill, so to speak. For example, in Louisiana, we do a lot of, I don't do the sampling, but Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries does a lot of sampling, and it's a sort of a surveillance monitoring, meaning they'll record anything they encounter. However, it's really designed to help understand the relative abundance and populations of things like redfish, sea trout, flounder, the species that are being actively managed by the state. So it's not to say they won't get a shark in there, but they're not really designed for sharks, because outside of weirdos like me that want to model this data, nobody's really, clamoring to have long-term shark population data.
We might someday.
Yeah.
Clayton's question. Clayton is asking, do you think that possibly the education of sport and commercial fishermen as to the importance of sharks and marine ecology may have increased the numbers, therefore the number of encounters?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something I've not been able to get at with any data. But I do think that one of the things, and you heard me say, we need tourism data, we need number of people in the water kind of data. I think that's missing, but I do think that a better understanding of the number of sharks in the water and where they are would be equally to perhaps even more important. Certainly, certain shark migrations are known times when attacks go up, which is just telling us that the number of sharks in the water certainly plays a role in what we might expect in terms of an increase in attacks. So, sharks by and large, but it's really hard to characterize, several hundred species in terms of how are they doing from a population standpoint, because it's such a mixed bag. But I would say that, especially in countries like the U.S. where there's active management, or at least more so than other countries, a lot of species, including sharks, are doing better than they were decades ago. And that comes from, as the question stated, it comes from sort of outreach and education efforts to tell anglers and those in the aquatic community that sharks are not there to kill you, and you can release them and you can encounter them and enjoy them without any harm on either you or the shark. But it also has to do with fishery regulations and how many sharks you may be allowed to keep as bycatch, and whether shark finning is allowed or not in certain places. And so I think that is a real missing piece here, but boy, there's just so little information about shark populations at any large scale that it's hard to really add that to what we did.
The Miller family has a question about whether you have looked at the relationship between number of attacks versus the amount of relevant coastline rather than the human population.
I have not, and that's a good question. I'm thinking of that along the lines of, so if we took the East Coast, maybe thinking about it in terms of miles of beach and not just pure, coastline or people. That's a great way to think about it, because really, the coastal habitats are visited disproportionately. If you have 10 miles of beach and 10 miles of mudflats and 10 miles of salt marsh, I can tell you where 99 out of 100 people are going to be. They're going to be at the beach. And so, that could be a great way. I appreciate Miller family for pointing that out. That could be a great way to sort of get at a more practical measure of that interface, that spatial interface between where people are and where they're going to encounter the sharks.
And then I have 3 more questions on the docket, if you don't mind. I know we're getting really close to 8 o'clock.
No worries.
David's question was, is if shark species, okay, as your trends changed, was the species of sharks represented a factor?
Well, not really. So, as I said, we didn't really have enough species level data to add it to the model, other than in that region analysis to say, let's cut up, the Earth and these shark areas that we're interested in by regions in which we would expect, based on habitat, the same shark to be inhabiting. So again, most of your shark attacks, if not all of them, on the west coast of the U.S. are going to be white sharks. Along the East Coast, you're going to get bull sharks and a few others. In Hawaii, you're going to get mostly tiger sharks, but a few others in there. We did not really, that was a question we had, or at least something we looked at once the data were processed, to say, in these places, in these 7 regions that have some species, aspect to them, are the places that are increasing, decreasing, or stable correlated with different types of attacks? And in fact, no. I mean, as I mentioned, Hawaii was on the increase, and that's a mixed, but it's a lot of tiger sharks. The Atlantic U.S. East Coast of the U.S. was increasing, and that's really sort of bull sharks and a suite of others that are largely not white sharks or tigers. And then the southern portion of Australia, we saw that's a little bit more of a white shark area. So we kind of saw different shark species in all the different places when it came to increases and decreases. So, there's more to learn there, but I would say from a really high level of what we looked at, it wasn't as though that, increases or decreases were strongly correlated across the globe with one species, or decreases were correlated with one species.
Very good. The next question is from Ross. Ross is asking why you think shark attacks might be rising, and how does he reduce the odds of attack? Any shark safety tips?
Yeah, so why are they increasing? Yeah, great question, and that's kind of what we set out to understand. Well, they're not increasing everywhere, so that's probably good news to most people. In the places they are increasing, it is places where we've seen a large increase in human population. So even though we accounted for human population, it could simply be that more people in the water results in a disproportionate increase in the number of attacks. I would tend to think it's that in combination with a number of shark species that are probably doing a little bit better population-wise than they have been in past decades. So the sort of long and short of it is more sharks and more people are in the water than they probably were in the past. In terms of shark safety tips, I included a few on one of the slides earlier, but avoid swimming at dawn, dusk, and night is number 1. Numbers 2 and 3 are don't go in the water with shiny objects on, and don't go in the water with open wounds or any kind of bleeding, because that's known to attract sharks. And then finally, obey any local regulations. If there's anything unique going on at a beach that might be a unique risk factor to that location, that should be posted. That should be common knowledge to beachgoers. And so make sure that you read any sort of warnings or notices that apply to the place where you're going to recreate.
Okay, I had a ichthyology instructor out in Oregon once who said, if you look like prey, you're gonna be prey. So don't surf and chum.
Yeah.
You're just asking for it if you're surfing and chum.
Yeah.
Which is funny, but true, right? You look like a seal from the bottom if you're on a surfboard.
Right. Yeah, or if you see a bait ball in the water, it could be that smaller fish are being eaten by medium-sized fish, but that also means that if there's sharks in the area, there may be something of interest for them too. So again, it's just sort of common sense. Be aware of your surroundings. Yeah, there's specific guidelines, but again, common sense is going to take you the farthest in this. And know that your risk is not zero, but you're much more likely to die in a car accident going to the beach than you are at the beach. So it's all it's all just being aware of your relative risks.
For sure. Maybe we're just starting to look more tasty as a species. I don't know. It's all that sugar, right? The last question of the night comes from Robert, and I had to ask this question. It's a brilliant question.
Okay.
So Robert's question is, do you think Sharknado set a whole new standard for shark attack genre, or was it merely a masterpiece?
So I will admit I have not seen Sharknado. I am, so I should just stop right there.
I get it.
No, I'm sort of a Jaws purist. I would not turn Sharknado off. Maybe the opportunity has just not been presented to me to watch it. But I have not seen it, so I'll withhold any comments on it.
Is it just the type? Is it because it's more spoofy, right? Than is it? I'm sorry, I'm picking your brain because I'm wondering. Yeah, it's interesting.
If you want to pick my brain on the movies that I've not seen that are culturally known to everybody, this is gonna be a long night. I've missed a lot of movies that everyone else has seen. So yeah, Sharknado is unfortunately one of them.
So you've not seen any of the Sharknados? Because there's like 5.
No, I have not. I think I know what I need to do this weekend.
I've only seen the first Sharknado. I will say that. I've only seen the first one. But I've watched, and here's a movie list for you guys in the audience, and you're free to make movie suggestions as I'm telling you my list. But of course, the first Sharknado, Dino Shark. Have you seen that one?
No.
Oh, wow. How about Sharktopus?
No.
It's a hybrid. It's a movie about a hybrid octopus and shark. Oh man, you gotta see it. It's used as a weapon.
I missed that one.
You're missing some great cinema.
I will, in my defense, I will say that I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old daughter, 2 daughters. And so I've seen Frozen and Frozen 2 about 100 times. And that's why I'm not able to watch all these shark cinema, because I'm rewatching Disney movies with kids.
I understand that one perfectly. Yeah, so we're not really getting any other suggestions for great movies. Maybe people quit watching when you're brought up Sharknado.
I thought Jaws 3 was not very good. And so as I kind of psychoanalyzed my movie going decisions, it could have been that because Jaws 3 was just not done well, that suggested to me that, you know, sort of spoofy shark movies are not gonna be what I want to watch. Which again
I
isn't.
didn't even know there was a Jaws 3.
Oh, yeah, there's 4 of them, and I've seen all those many times. But yeah, I guess one bad Jaws, and I was kind of turned off from some of the more kitschy shark movies.
I don't know. Sharknado. Mm, yeah. At least you would understand people's jokes.
I know. I need
You
to see
watched
it.
Yeah. Aaron says they're all classic movies, especially with lots of alcohol. so her advice is to have alcohol in hand.
Okay.
And Peter is suggesting The Reef. Have you seen The Reef?
No, but I know I have heard of that one, and I've seen a trailer for it.
I've not heard of that one.
Yeah, I did hear of that one. Wow, I got my movie list cut out for the next 6 months, I think.
I know, right? So yeah.
Good thing we're in a pandemic.
So audience, if you're out there and you're on social media, if you want to suggest some good shark movies for Steve, you can just tag us on social media with a list of recommended shark movies. And I'll be sure to get them to him. Yeah, that's awesome.
That'd be great.
Poor sharks, you know. They're not important enough to actually understand population-wise, but they're important to our cinema culture.
Right. Yeah, most of us are only ever going to see a shark on the big screen, but.
Oh, it's so sad in a way. All right, so we will move on and call it a night, you guys. Thank you so much, Steve, for giving such a great talk and teaching us a little bit more about shark encounters.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
For the audience who are out there, we are moving to an every other week schedule for science talks throughout the fall. So our next talk is on August 20th with Dr. Andrew Barron from BitNet. So just keep in mind that we are moving to the every other week schedule. Of course, for any talk information, you can go to the website, that's lumcon.edu/science-talks to check out our upcoming speaker list, which is being updated daily, and for all recordings of the talk. Remember, if you attend 10 LumCon Science Talks, you get a research, I almost said shark, research vessel Pelican Challenge coin. So some of you have probably earned your coin tonight, and some of you are probably one talk closer to earning yours. So we'll call it an evening. We'll let you guys get on with your shark movie watching, and and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks again, Steve. Thanks, audience. You are wonderful as always.
Thank you, Mert. Appreciate the opportunity.
Good evening, everyone.